Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night. My name is Ana. I'm welcome back to the Conn Law Firm podcast. And as always, I'm here with Mr. Andy Conn from the Conn Law in Savannah, Georgia. Today, we're going to have a very nice episode. We're going to get into something that directly determines how much money someone walks away with a car accident, their injuries. I know it's a very sensitive topic when it comes to the injuries post-accident, but not all of the injuries are treated the same in the legal system. There is the issue of a soft tissue strain, traumatic brain injury, different outcomes when it comes to compensation. And according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, there are over 2 million people injured in car crashes every year in the United States. So today, here in Chatham County, with the volume of traffic, serious car accident injuries, we are with Mr. Andy Conn to talk about everything that's going on, any advice, and how many of those people do not realize the type of injuries they have suffered, how to document it, and how long treatment may take. Andy, you have seen every kind of injury walk through your door, from accidents to little major disasters in Savannah. So before we get to the specifics, what is the one thing that most accident victims misunderstand about how injuries translate into compensation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a misunderstanding or if it's just, if it's not what you do every day, maybe you don't really have much of an expectation for what to expect in terms of compensation. But certainly, I mean, as a general rule, the more injured you are, the higher your sort of the case value is, the more your case is worth. There are 100 other factors that go into that other than just injuries. But sort of a good rule of thumb is if you've been rendered paralyzed versus having a soft injury, soft tissue back injury, the former is going to be obviously a much higher value case than the latter.
And when it comes to that type of injury severity, the compensation value, would you determine that there are different types of car accident injuries that influence the recovery when it comes to that type of compensation?
So when it comes to a car accident, not like a med mal or a products case, sometimes one thing that insurance companies will look at, which I don't think is always a good test of what a jury will do, but sometimes insurance companies will look at what's called the property damage. So if they get the case file and you see a wreck where the vehicle is totaled or looks like an accordion, they might give a little bit more weight to some of the reported injuries as opposed to some cases where there's just a scratch or a small dent on a car. The same type of injuries in both of those cases. Most of the time, the insurance companies are going to give more weight to that case that shows more of the property damage. Now, a good attorney is going to be able to explain why in either of those scenarios, you might actually sustain a serious injury. In Georgia, we have what's called the Eggshell Plaintiff rule, meaning just like an eggshell is easy to crack. Even though it's easy to crack, if you're the person who cracks that shell or causes someone injury, even if they're more susceptible to that injury, you're liable for the resulting injuries. So even in sometimes these lower property damage cases, having a really good experienced trial attorney will help you manage explaining to the insurance adjuster and eventually the jury how that caused a significant injury.
And when it comes to a bigger picture, like a landscape picture of the personal injury and the type of accidents, coming from your comment, could you let us know a little bit more about how would you handle as an attorney the injury spectrum, the type of documentation needed, if there are damage categories that we need to know in order to be aware of the influence that we can have on our compensation as the victim in an accident?
Yeah, well, I always instruct my clients that really a lot of it's going to be up to you. You need to be making sure that you're making medical appointments. If you're recommended for additional sorts of therapies or diagnostics, you need to be the one following up with these things. Another thing that's really important is sometimes you might have 4 or 5 different injuries. Really, one is nagging you the most at first. And we have a tendency to tell our medical providers the most pressing thing at any of our medical visits. I always encourage my clients, make sure your medical providers at every single meeting know everything that's going on with you, because even though that might be the thing that's hurting the most, for instance, you might have a broken wrist, right? And that's something that hurts really bad, but it's going to usually clear up and heal, over several months. Whereas you might have a back injury that at the time doesn't hurt as much. But if you have a herniated disc, then that might be something that requires years of recovery, if you can even fully recover at all. So make sure that you're, as a client, reporting all of those things, because otherwise they'll try to point to gaps in coverage or gaps in treatment, which is something you want to try to avoid when necessary, when possible.
I liked a phrase that you used on episode 2 when we were talking about the medical treatment side. And I think it's very important to also mention it here. You are your biggest advocate when it comes to the medical treatment. I think it was such a great way that you phrased it for our past episode. You are the one to let the doctors know, hey, I need this. I want this. This doesn't feel right. I want further treatment. I want further this. Because at the end of the day, you are the victim. You are the one that's feeling it's your body, it's your injuries, it's your pain. So having that sense of authority over yourself, I think it's a very important thing to note also when it comes to personal injury and car accidents. And in a possible scenario, what would happen if 2 people have the same type of injuries, but one walks away with significant more compensation because of how their accident, their medical treatment plan, and everything was documented? Is there a gap in practice in Georgia? Why do these situations may arise when it comes to the type of documentation that you do for your case?
Sure. The most obvious answer is sometimes it's just a matter of who has the better attorney. There are some cases where the level of experience of the attorney doesn't matter as much, but in most cases, if you're talking about one type of recovery versus another one, usually it's the more experienced trial attorney who's actually tried cases and understands what sort of value there can be. And frankly, insurance companies, they look at the attorney that you hire. They see, has this attorney tried cases and do they have positive results in those trials? So that's probably the first and foremost. The other thing is very client dependent, right? It's just like we talked about. If you're not following up with doctors' recommendations, if you're not getting the physical therapy that you're recommended, or perhaps a doctor is telling you that you need surgery. Surgery is a scary thing, and I certainly understand when folks opt not to do that, but that is going to change the value of your case.
It does make a lot of sense when looking at it this way, especially when it comes to surgery. And I think it's a good point to notice. And we were also discussing a little bit about the process when it comes to, or the leading up to an orthopedic surgery, for example. It can be a very scary situation. And I think also it's also important to know that at the end of the day, when it comes to your body and the fears that it may have, it may sometimes lead to a not so beneficial, not only in a compensation way, but also in medical way. I've never been in a situation. I always like when we're talking to give out the notice that personally, I haven't been in a situation where I have to choose whether to have orthopedic surgery or not, but it's a good thing to notice that type of decision making. And I think we can dwell a little in severe injuries when it comes to car accidents or personal injuries. Do you believe that more, or in this specific case, severe injuries typically would lead to a larger compensation payout in a car accident case? This might seem a little obvious on the surface, but the mechanics around it can be a little important for clients that don't really know, or that would assume a very severe injury would cost a very big payout, or my injury is not as severe as this, so it would lead to a different type of payout. But from your perspective, why do more severe injuries typically lead to a larger compensation?
They do oftentimes, sometimes they don't. When all else is equal, if you have the same venue, the same injuries, the same, or excuse me, not the same injuries, but the same lawyer, the same type of accident, the more severe injury is going to have a higher compensation level than the less severe injury for obvious reasons. The more hurt you are, the more entitled you are to a higher compensation package. Where it gets really tricky is it's not always about just what the severity of the injury is. Sometimes I've had cases all the time where in one case, there will be $1 million policy available for the driver who hit my client, and my client will have a soft tissue injury that's not worth $1 million. Then I'll have another case the next day where I have a client who's unfortunately paralyzed or has lost a limb, and there's only $25,000 in insurance coverage. That's an example where even a soft tissue injury case might be worth more than a catastrophic injury case, just simply because there's more insurance available. And most people always ask, can't you pursue those funds against the person who hit me? You certainly can. It's just almost impossible in most instances unless a doctor or a lawyer hits you. Usually they're not going to have the type of funds to be able to compensate you, and you're going to force them into a bankruptcy situation. So there's really a lot more factors that go into the value of a case than just the injuries. But certainly your point is one that's true, which is the more hurt you are, all things equal, the more your compensation is going to be.
And would you say that there's an actual classification system within the legal world, or at least in Georgia, that determines the catastrophic versus moderate or versus minor? Or is it determined case by case depending on the situation, like the example you were giving us?
Yeah, definitely case by case. And the reason for that is because jurors ultimately are the deciding factor of case value. And jurors don't have a little cheat sheet that tells them what a case is worth and what injury constitutes a catastrophic injury versus which one doesn't constitute a catastrophic injury. Typically, my rule of thumb when I'm evaluating cases, typically I'm handling the more catastrophic side of cases. And usually what that means to me is something that's either significantly life-altering and permanent. Sometimes that means a traumatic brain injury. And sometimes that means paralysis. Sometimes that means loss of a limb. Sometimes it can mean a bad burn. It can mean something such as maybe you do just have a really bad back injury. It doesn't cause paralysis, but it might be something that you have to deal with for the rest of your life. And you might have to get a spinal cord stimulator. That's really when we're talking about catastrophic injuries. The non-catastrophic side of things are those cases where you had a bad experience and it definitely wasn't fun for you and it was a terrible experience, but maybe you're going to get better or get very close to getting to better and getting back to your normal level of activities. That typically would not constitute a catastrophic injury case.
Okay. And I hear the word whiplash a lot. I think that's one of the most common injuries people think of after a car accident. And there's a lot of published data showing that soft tissue injuries account for a significant percent of the crash-related accidents. But is there a perception problem with these claims? And I feel like that can be a little or particularly challenging in a high-volume court system like Chatham County. But how do you, or if you could further explain specifically with this whiplash situation, as I think it's one of the most common situations. How do soft tissue injuries like whiplash affect a car accident compensation claim here in Georgia?
Yeah, in terms of a stigma for whiplash, it just depends what you're claiming it did to you. If you had whiplash and you truly do only have soft tissue injuries, then you're probably not asking for as much money. And I don't think there's a stigma with whiplash as long as you're reasonable in your approach to what you might expect to recover in a situation like that. However, I'd push back a little bit because whiplash, you get that term all the time. You'll leave the ER and they'll diagnose you with whiplash, right? Because they're just trying at the ER to make sure that you're not in immediately some sort of imminent life-altering event, right? Like you're not about to die, and then they're going to send you home. They might diagnose you with whiplash. I had a case, it's been a couple of years ago now, where my clients, all three of them were in a car wreck, were diagnosed with whiplash at the ER. All three of them, though, had hit their heads. It was a pretty violent collision, but the ER discharged them with whiplash. Two of those three in the vehicle actually had traumatic brain injuries. That wasn't readily apparent at the scene of the accident, wasn't readily apparent to the ER. But once they went through extensive testing with neurologists and neuropsychologists, it was determined that they did actually have some pretty significant traumatic brain injuries. And they were reporting things like brain fog and forgetting things. And so we had those clients tested for all sorts of things like their loss of executive functioning. And again, that quote unquote whiplash case became very quickly a 7-figure case that we were able to resolve here in Chatham County, Georgia.
Wow. And of course, your first thought when it comes to these situations, I would have never thought myself if I was in that situation, like, oh, this is most definitely a traumatic brain injury. This is what I'm feeling. When people hear the word traumatic brain injury, you go to the worst case scenario of no mobility, the typical movie frame where you're like bandaged around in your head and you're just laying there. But the determination of what comes into it, I think it's a very good thing that you've mentioned how it's not really as dramatic as you would think it would happen. It's something that you need to get consistently tested for and then come into this realization and diagnostic. And
right. Yeah, one thing,
little,
traumatic brain injury is a very wide definition. It means a lot of different things. There's more of a layperson's categorization of traumatic brain injuries from mild, moderate, and severe. Severe is typically you're in a coma, you have some sort of permanent brain damage. Moderate is really much more than you think. It's even though you walked away from the scene maybe that day, you're having these long-term effects. And then a mild traumatic brain injury typically is in reference to a concussion. Concussions are traumatic brain injuries that can have some lasting effects. You might hear like post-concussive syndrome, things of that nature. So there are different, not all traumatic brain injuries are created equal, right? They're different, but you have to have somebody who understands traumatic brain injuries to be able to help you manage that process, get you to the right experts for evaluation so that they can do what's right for your legal case.
And when it comes to the impact of compensation and litigation timelines and car accidents for traumatic brain injury, could you tell us a little bit more about that? What type of specific documentation, what type of, do you include lifetime damages? What is the type of consideration that Georgia has when it comes to, for example, a statute of limitation? Can you tell us a little bit about how we would work around a traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, well, especially in the traumatic brain injury context, it's one of the more difficult types of cases to handle because, typically your medical bills are much lower. It doesn't take as much money to treat oftentimes a traumatic brain injury. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And so sometimes it takes longer to understand the full extent of a traumatic brain injury. Just like with any other type of more obvious injury, sometimes you heal. And that's a good thing. We want people to heal. Sometimes you don't heal. And sometimes you don't know whether you're going to heal or not before the statute of limitations, which in Georgia is just 2 years. Typically 2 years is when you kind of know. If you haven't healed from a traumatic brain injury, you're probably not going to heal from it. But you don't want to wait until the day of to file your lawsuit. So you want someone who's helping you manage that process ahead of time. And you want to go ahead and be ready to, if it is necessary, to file a lawsuit or to file that claim prior to the 2-year statute of limitations. And then you can, once you're in litigation and you've preserved your claims, then you can sort of see where those injuries go and see if you're able to fully recover or unfortunately not.
How about a delay in symptoms? For example, I'm in a car crash. I feel fine for 2 weeks, 3. And then I started suddenly having headaches, memory problems, that kind of brain fog that you mentioned. Could that delay in my symptoms cause any type of issues within my compensation claim?
Yeah, again, it comes back to who's your lawyer, because that to me is not an issue. Jurors do not punish you for not recognizing something for a couple of weeks. Insurance adjusters oftentimes will try to lower what they're willing to offer, but you have to have an experienced trial attorney who's able to say, no, that is not fair compensation. We're going to move forward with litigation because you're not evaluating this like a juror would. There's a lot of times for a lot of different reasons why it might take 2-3 weeks, even longer, before you start to really notice particular symptoms. One reason might be because you went to the ER and got a whole bunch of painkillers. And so even though you've got an underlying issue, you might not be feeling that issue in those 2-3 week periods. There's a lot of orthopedic surgeons who will testify to that. Another reason might be, like we discussed earlier, you might just be focused on something that's hurting more in the short term and not really paying attention to this nagging injury that's there that maybe you're not reporting because you don't think it's a big deal. But then that nagging injury might start to progress, and you might realize through other diagnostic testing that actually there's something really serious going on there that needs to be taken care of. So I, in particular, I understand when my clients have a 2-3 week delay before they recognize some of their symptoms, especially with traumatic brain injury type symptoms. Those can sometimes be very subtle, but you need an experienced trial attorney to be able to explain why that's the case.
And now that you mentioned the experienced trial attorney, how about spinal cord injuries? I know those are the ones that sound a little scary, a little harder to deal with, especially since they come with a lot of medical treatment. And how do a spinal cord injury influence both size of compensation, but also the duration of a lawsuit? Specifically talking about, on my experience when it comes to spinal injuries, the type of medical treatment plan that's needed can sometimes be very long, very tenuous for the person, a lot of testing, a lot of pain management, a lot of physical therapy. How do spinal cord injuries influence on the case?
Yeah, some of the toughest cases to deal with, unfortunately, are these spinal cord injury cases. I have several clients currently and over the years who have had spinal cord injuries. They're some of the saddest to deal with because oftentimes you're literally ripping someone's independence from them. You're ripping their life away from them. I have a client right now who he's in his early 30s and is permanently paralyzed. He's got 2 little girls that he's still a great dad, and he's got a great wife and family around him that are very supportive. And he's the type that still is able to do quite a bit, but still to think about the things that he's unable to do as a result of this spinal cord injury. But one of the reasons why spinal cord injuries take longer to litigate is just simply because you're bringing a significant claim, which means they're going to hire more sophisticated defense attorneys. They're going to hire and spend more money on experts. They're going to do everything in their power to poke holes in your case, to try to delay, put in these delay tactics to make your compensation time a lot longer. So when you have a soft tissue injury, they're not going to hire the same type of attorneys. They're not going to hire the same type of experts. They're not going to spend the type of money and time to basically make your life a living hell as they are when you bring a significant spinal cord injury or other catastrophic injury case. And so again, you have to have someone who not only understands the injury and how to get the right folks in place, life care planners, for instance, economists, to talk about the full value of what this is going to cost you over the course of your life, but also someone who can move your case at a quicker pace. Again, it takes someone who's experienced in these sort of catastrophic injury cases to be able to move your case efficiently.
And if you can include also, how about a little timeline? Is there a point in their recovery or a moment? Should it happen immediately? Should I start my treatment first? Or when is it a good time to start pursuing the legal claim when it comes to a spinal cord injury?
It depends on the type of claim. Certainly, when you have a spinal cord injury, probably the last thing you're thinking about is a legal claim. The first thing you're thinking about is, oh my God, am I going to walk again? Am I going to be able to toss my daughter on the beach? Those things like that. You're not thinking about litigation. So it's completely understandable not to think of that. I will say, though, depending on the type of claim, it is really super important to get an attorney involved as quickly as possible, especially if it's a product liability case, for instance. When it comes to product liability cases, you have to have the product preserved. You have to do several different types of investigations depending on the type of case that can only happen, some of which can only happen shortly after the spinal cord injury occurs. So while it's not fun to think about and it's not the first thing on your mind, if you've got a good family around you that can help you manage that and find an experienced an attorney to just handle that so you can focus on whether you're going to be able to walk again, I think you need to do that as quickly as possible because some of these investigations, preserving evidence is incredibly important in these cases. I've unfortunately had to turn down cases in the past where they came to me too late, and there wasn't enough evidence preserved to be able to bring a catastrophic injury claim. And so I highly recommend trying to get someone involved sooner than later.
Great. I think that last part is very important to have it be clear for anyone that may be going through the aftermath of a personal injury, a car accident claim. And now we've covered the injury severity that drives the compensation from soft tissue to traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord. Now I want to dwell into a little more specific type of injury, broken bones, internal injuries. You've mentioned burns. How are they evaluated in Georgia? What role do medical experts plays on building this type of claims?
Yeah, what you said is definitely true. And each case is different. Each type of injury is different. When it comes to broken bones are sometimes a little bit easier because your bone's not broken. Somebody hits you in a car, your bone is broken. You don't need a rocket scientist to prove that up. Some cases are much different. Burn injuries, I've had burn injury cases in the past where I had one particular client that I'm thinking of where his burn actually didn't appear to be terribly extensive when it first happened, right? It hurt really bad and he was in a lot of pain. He went to the hospital, but they basically said this is maybe a first degree burn, could be a little bit more, just come back for treatment. And what we know about burn injuries is they can actually develop over time. A lot of people don't realize that. There's actually a medical term for it. But in this particular patient, his developed into second and third degree burns over the next couple of days. So even though initially it seemed like, yeah, this hurts and it's bad, it didn't seem like a quote unquote catastrophic burn injury case. It turned into exactly that. And that's a case we actually tried here in Chatham County. It was a few years back. We actually settled it in the middle of trial. But understanding these types of claims, understanding burn injuries, understanding the different types of broken bone cases are really important. You have to know who the right experts are, what experts you need in these types of cases to be able to be successful.
Would you think that this type of injuries, when it comes to breaking your bones, are one of the more straightforward injuries to document? They come very clearly on imaging. There's really not a way that you can deny this. But for example, like the example that you were given is a couple episodes back about the specific client didn't even understand or know that she had her broken wrist because of the adrenaline rushing. And maybe in a situation like that, my adrenaline's rushing. In the first instance, just for XYZ reason, I don't want to go through imaging. And after a couple of days, pain becomes unbearable. I still go it. But would it still be one of the most straightforward things to document? Or would I cause any type of issues in my claim if there is a little delay because of that adrenaline?
Yeah, with a broken bone case, I don't think you're going to really hurt your case. It's going to be really hard for the defense to prove when you have a broken bone that it was caused by something else. That's one thing that, again, adrenaline happens and the shock of what just happened to you happens. So it's okay if you don't go to the hospital right away. Certainly, I would recommend you do that. But even if you don't, once you start to feel, man, my wrist really hurts or my whatever is still nagging me, get the treatment once you've calmed down, once the adrenaline has died down, because you definitely want to be able to document that sort of as soon as possible. But yeah, with broken bones, yeah, that's one that really, you still need a good attorney for the other aspects of the case, explaining why it's important. But at the end of the day, that's one that's a lot easier to prove than a traumatic brain injury or even a back injury or a neck injury.
What about if a fracture heals fully, but the person, for some reason, they had to take 3 months of work, go through physical therapy? What about those lost wages? Are they recoverable under law? Are they taken into consideration for their case, their claim, and their compensation? Of course, it is a very straightforward. There's clear proof that I did have a fracture or broken bone. But when it comes to the case and the effect that it may have on my daily day basis, is this something that we can take into consideration within our case?
Yeah, lost wages are certainly something that you can and should take into consideration for the right case. Not every case, but oftentimes. But it's just like any other form of damages. You have to prove that whatever the incident was that caused your injuries also caused you to miss time at work, which in turn caused you to miss out on those wages. Sometimes that's easy. Sometimes if you're in a coma, you can't go to work, right? Sometimes it's a little more difficult. Sometimes when you have a neck or a back injury, maybe there's not really good radiographs to show whatever you're feeling. Maybe it's a soft injury case. Oftentimes that's a little bit harder to prove the lost wages claim. Certainly something you should still be bringing, though, because if you can't lift the box at Walmart and that's what your job is because your back hurts, then I think you've got a pretty good argument that you have a lost wages claim.
And how about internal injuries? There, we've heard a little bit about the proving of those lost wages, how the broken bones, TBIs. But when it comes to internal injuries, which are one of the most dangerous ones because they're not visible, they don't really present symptoms immediately. There's been a lot of publication on data on how internal organ damage from blunt force trauma is often missed in that initial emergency room evaluation. So how do internal injuries impact the value and most importantly, the complexity of the accident compensation claim?
Yeah, it's always going to increase the level of complexity because now you're talking about a different type of injury that perhaps requires some extra level of medical proof, right? You can't just say that you have an internal injury. There has to be some documentation in the medical charting. And then there's got to be some sort of either expert or treating medical provider who would be willing to say the symptoms this person's having, this internal organ injury that's been documented was due to this traumatic event and not due to some other cause. And so it does raise the complexity a little bit. But as you mentioned, it is something that just frankly gets missed oftentimes in ERs because ERs are often taking x-rays. You don't really see much on x-rays about internal organs. And again, more so for your health than anything, as soon as you feel something that's not right, you need to seek medical treatment immediately.
And that delay in discovery, that I'm not sure, I've never had an internal organ injury, so I'm not really sure how the time of feeling that the damage would work. But when it comes to a delay in discovery, for example, if I go to the ER, they're missed on the first visit, would that create a gap that an insurance company would try to exploit?
I think insurance companies might do that, but I think that would be to their own detriment. Again, sometimes insurance companies think like robots, and usually that's a really good thing for trial attorneys when they think like that, because that means that they're probably going to make a mistake. Jurors do not think like robots. Jurors think like human beings because they are human beings. And so a quote unquote delay from an internal organ injury, them trying to beat you up with that is really a bad idea. Most seasoned defense attorneys would steer away from that at trial, although sometimes you have defense attorneys who also would try to beat up a plaintiff about not recognizing something that the ER didn't even recognize until days or weeks later. To me, that's a gift. That's something you can use to show that you're the credible authority in the room with the jury, not the defense. So I usually like when they discredit these internal organ injuries in cases and try to say that it's your fault or you should have done something differently, even though somebody else is the one who smashed into you or caused the injury.
The challenge.
Yeah.
And you had previously mentioned burn injuries. When it comes to burns, there's also a very big spectrum. It can be a light burn. It can be disfiguring. It can be a very life-altering injury that carries both emotional and physical weight. How would this be handled when it comes to a compensation claim? Burn injuries, severe burn injuries that may cause even a type of disfigurement for the person at being the victim of the situation. Could you tell us a little bit more about how this specific situation would be handled?
Yeah, burn injuries are just some of the most horrific types of injuries you can have. And again, it's a spectrum. Not all burn injuries are the same. Some are to small areas of your body or first and second degree burns, and some are to bigger portions of your body. But they are, again, there's a reason why in the Bible, when people go to hell, they're put in a fiery pit. It's because that is one of the most conceptual hells that you can possibly think of. Some of my clients over the years who have had burn injuries have unfortunately gone through just some of the worst hell you can possibly think of in these burn injury cases. Like I said, sometimes they are nasty and they require oftentimes months of inpatient treatment. I've had clients who have spent several months at the Augusta Burn Center, which is one of the best burn centers, by the way, in the entire world here in Georgia. We're lucky to have them, but it's managing those types of cases. I've had clients who have bounced back from burn injuries relatively well, and I've had clients who just frankly are never able to get over it, either physically or emotionally. It's something that I think probably more so than any other type of injury brings with it a level of just shock and fear and nightmares that in PTSD that oftentimes just does not go away, because experiencing something like that, one of the most horrific things you can go through as a human being.
And when it comes to that type, that Bible expert, it was such an impactful thing, because it is true. I don't think that the type of pain that has been described by burn victims, it sounds like one of the most horrible situations to be placed in. And that anxiety, that PTSD, that depression that may come from burn scarring, disfigurement, and even when it's such a visible type of scarring, such an impactful thing to see. Do you quantify the emotional and psychological impact in dollar terms for the insurance company or a jury when it comes to this type of cases?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things to do, right? And it's not just one of the hardest things for attorneys like me to do. It's one of the hardest things for jurors to do. What is the value of pain? What is the value of suffering? What is the value of not being able to sleep at night because you're having nightmares reliving the incident? It is hugely difficult. And I'm always very honest with juries when I have trials that involve high amounts of pain, suffering, emotional distress, that, hey, this is going to be the hardest decision maybe that you've ever made, because it is so difficult to put a dollar and cent on, because you really can't do that. Unfortunately, the only way our civil justice system works is to try to put a dollar and cent value on it. And again, I think it comes down to a case-by-case situation. Everybody's grief is not created equal. Some people's grief, some people's pain, some people's suffering is just different than others. Sometimes it comes down to how well is your client able to relate those facts. And I think you need a good attorney to help the clients understand how to relate to a jury and explain what they've been through. Not to say that it's not terrible on its face, but sometimes people need a little bit of help opening up and explaining what they've been through. And yeah, we certainly do eventually put values on it when we're trying to settle a case. At trial, we try to put usually a range of values that we propose to a jury, but ultimately it's up to 12 strangers, 12 jurors who have to unanimously decide what the value of that pain is.
And I think it's very important that you mentioned that assistant understanding and having someone help you understand what you're going through and understanding what you're feeling. And I think we can go a little into medical experts, and we can help us understand a little, what role do medical experts play when determining a compensation for a serious accident in general here in Georgia?
Yeah, all experts are not created equal. I know I've said that about several different aspects, but experts are so important. And that means that your evaluation and your investigation into picking the right experts is also hugely important. You don't want an expert who's going to overreach and who's going to not use science-based principles in forming their conclusions. A good attorney is going to do an investigation to see, has this expert testified in past cases that are similar to this? Did a court exclude their opinions for some reason? How do they present? That's really important too. You could have Stephen Hawking as your expert, but if he's unable to be presentable and explain himself to a jury, then it might not be as effective. Although Stephen Hawking's one of my favorites, and he's very good at explaining things. But you know what I mean by that is you have to find an expert who is equal parts smart and an authority figure on the subject, but also presentable and charismatic and able to help a jury understand this very complex thing that they're dealing with. So yeah, experts are hugely important. And being able to evaluate and pick the right ones is also just so important to catastrophic injury cases.
And would you think that these experts are also able to determine treatment timelines? Every accident victim, I feel like, wants to know how long it's going to take. Answer really usually
Sure.
depends on the jury. But in insurance information, the institute usually tracks settlement timelines across jury categories. And there's a lot of variation when it comes to it. Would the attorney come as an expert when it comes to understanding the timeline of the case, how long it's going to take? Do certain injuries make it settle faster compared to others?
Yeah, you better have an attorney who's experienced in a case and able to understand what the sort of the value of the case is, so you can advise your clients when it's time to consider a resolution and for how much. But yeah, there are specific experts. Some experts go to what we call the liability side of things. They talk about the product that failed, or the doctor who violated the standard of care, or perhaps an accident reconstructionist who shows how a car wreck happened. They're not really going to talk about the timeline of damages or your injuries typically. However, there are experts who do go into detail about that. One particular type of expert is a life care planner. That's someone who, especially in catastrophic injury cases, can sit down with you and your family, come to your home, see what sorts of things your home needs so that you can function as closely as possible to your pre-injury functioning. They'll take a look at your medical records and future medical needs, and they'll chart out a plan over the course of your life to show what you need to make your life as comfortable as possible after whatever unfortunate event you've been through. Part of the same team would be an economist. Economists are able to take that life care plan and put a specific number dollar value on what that costs today to be able to provide you with all these things over the course of time. Economists are also really good at showing your lost wages, not just your current lost wages, but what are you going to miss out on in the future from not being able to work? And again, having the right team of experts, not just for the liability side, but for showing the jury what you're going to have to go through for the rest of your life, hugely important.
And would you say, as a very experienced attorney, is there a point during a case when you know it's going to either settle or go to trial that you let your client know about?
Yeah, most cases do settle. Fortunately or unfortunately, us trial attorneys, we're crazy people. We like to be in trial, even though it's very stressful and time consuming and it's time away from family and friends. We love it. But we also understand most cases are going to resolve. The way I prepare every case, though, is I don't let myself believe it's going to ever settle. So I prepare every single case as if it's going to trial, so that the ones that do go to trial, we're not caught slacking. We have all of our ducks in a row. We have the right experts. We've done the right research. We've taken the right depositions, and it's ready for trial. And if it settles, that's great. And I'm happy for the clients if they decide it's something that's valuable to them. And quite frankly, working a case up as if it's going to trial is frankly the best way to settle a case, because the defense attorneys know which attorneys are going to be prepared to try a case and which ones they can catch flat-footed at the last second and get a discount on the case. So I always advocate, let's focus on trial. And if they want to make some offers in the meantime, we may or may not consider them, but we are preparing for trial.
And within these two last questions that we've gone on, combining a little bit the information given, especially since you noted that sometimes an expert can note with the type of care that you're going to need in the future. And what if there is a car accident injury that requires years or decades into the future? Numbers can get very large very quickly. Would this still be something that is going to increase the value of the car accident, or is it part of just the documentation process of what may happen in the future?
Sure. Unfortunately, we do have times of protracted litigation. Sometimes you just can't avoid it. I'll say this, for the significant majority of my cases that do take longer, usually the longer it's taking, the better it's becoming for the client. We're taking more depositions of the folks that worked for the company who are all of a sudden telling us things that Now we understand why this sort of thing happened, why the ball was dropped, and that increases the value of cases. Also, if you're in a protracted litigation, it probably means that you have some sort of catastrophic injury claim. And so over time, you're able to develop with your experts really all the aspects and fine tune those things for trial. But they can get very expensive. Most catastrophic injury cases that don't settle early, which most don't, do get very, very expensive. Fortunately, in my world, I work on contingency fee agreements, and I put up all the expenses on the front end. So even if we're spending $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 on the case, Conn law covers those case expenses on the front end. So you're not having to come out of pocket in a sticky situation to try to litigate the case. And then if there is a recovery, then you would reimburse out of the proceeds of the resolution, and not on the front end. So I always tell all of my clients, who are maybe a little bit hesitant to get involved in a claim, that you will never come out of pocket to pay me for anything until there's a resolution. And at that time, you're also putting money in your own pocket.
That's such a great thing to note when it comes to at least your personal practice. This reminder to people, there is a way that this is being handled. There's no laws, no further wages being lost on your behalf, and just the care that it would take. Aside from being a victim in a car accident and having so many medical issues and problems and stresses, at least we can always make the note of an experienced lawyer, as yourself, is always going to know how to handle the case and be a part of the team, whether it be medical documentation, whether knowing if it's going to understanding the background behind. I think we can also know to give it out there on your personal and professional experience. What should accident victims understand about how their injuries affect both compensation and legal timeline of their case? This is how we bring it all together. If there is someone out there watching that has been in a car accident, we also make a note. It may be recent, it may be months ago. They're trying to figure out where they stand, what to do, where to go. They're reading so much information and getting all confused and knowing where to start. What should an accident victim in Georgia understand about the effects of both their injuries, the compensation, legal timelines under your professional experience?
Yeah, so again, every case is very different and every timeline is going to be a little bit different. For some of the less severe types of injury cases, they typically go a little bit quicker. They typically they settle before you ever have to file a lawsuit. And so really the timeline is, when are you done treating, to know what sort of the scope of your injuries are so that you can send a demand to be able to wrap that case up. But with the catastrophic type of injury cases, oftentimes they take a lot longer. First of all, we just oftentimes in the first year, 2 years, even 3, 4 years, don't know the extent of your injuries. Where are they going? Are you going to get better? Oftentimes you're not going to get better, but how much better can you get? So that takes time. And it also, again, when you have a catastrophic injury case, more sophisticated defense attorneys, by and large, you're going to have more experts on the other side fighting against you. And it just takes more time in those cases. But from cases I have, it ranges all the way from, I had a case that resolved a week after the wreck. That happened just last week. And I've had cases that have taken 6, 7 years, and everything in between, by the way. So it really just depends on your type of case.
I think that's a very important point to make. Timeline wise, it's not something that we're going to be able to control, but understanding it definitely does make you take better decisions.
Yeah, you can control it to an extent, right? Some attorneys who aren't as experienced might not be able to do things in an efficient manner. So you can definitely control what you can control, but there are certainly aspects of it that you can't control that are going to cause it to take longer to resolve.
Great advice. Very true. When it comes to an experienced seasoned attorney, definitely there is a certain level of control about what happens. Andy, I think this has been incredibly valuable. We have covered from soft tissues, broken bones, how are they valued, traumatic brain injuries, spinal documentation, experts, so much more. For someone watching right now, whether it be anywhere in Georgia really, who has been injured in a car accident, for this episode, what is it, the one thing that you want them to walk away with?
Yeah, the one thing is that you don't have to fight this fight alone. You certainly need to take care of yourself and get the medical that you need, but you have an ally to take care of the legal side, and we at Conn Law are here to do that. Email, call us, our website, go look at our results, connlawfirm.com. My email is andy@connlawfirm.com. That's ANDY. And our telephone number is 917-8642. Give us a call. We're happy to help.
Perfect. You've heard it here, folks. This is Andy Conn. It was a pleasure to have you here, Andy. Always a pleasure to speak with you and learn from your amazing expertise in with your law background, with who you are as a person. Come to admire Andy in great aspects and have this very experienced, seasoned attorney help us understand what comes before, during, after a car accident. It's always such an honor to have you, Andy. Thank you very much for your time. We will see you guys next episode. And you heard it here. If you guys are currently a victim or have been a victim of a car accident, you have any questions, please reach out to Mr. Andy Conn of the Conn Law Firm. Thank you, guys. We hope you have a great day. Thank you so much, Andy, for being here.
Thank you.